Since its inception in 2013, old school RuneScape has borrowed a good deal of content from RuneScape 3, whether that be directly, with a good example being God War's Dungeon, or in the form of a heavy influence such as the Voidwaker sword drawing inspiration from the Karasi. Sometimes it happens in reverse, and RuneScape 3 borrows from old school RuneScape. I'll also be including updates that aren't what some would consider recycled content, but are more just a clear borrowing of ideas. That being said, this is not a full exhaustive list, and I will unintentionally miss things. I'm not a robot that knows every facet of the game. Also, anything that was ported over immediately from the 2007 version of RuneScape to old school will not count for this video. If it did, we would be here for literally days. Let's get into a few examples throughout the years. The Hex Hunter bow is a shield bow on RuneScape 3 currently, and for those not familiar with the combat system, shield bows do less damage overall but can utilize both two-hand bow and shield abilities at the same time. What many people might not know is the Hex Hunter used to be restricted to only being used in dungeoneering and used to be classified as a longbow. The real kicker and what puts it in this video though is that before the evolution of combat, the Hex Hunter used to do increased damage based on the target's magic level. The higher the target's magic level, the more the bow's damage scaled up. Guess what else is a longbow and currently has the same effect as the old Hex Hunter? The Twisted Bow on old school RuneScape, which arrived nearly 7 years after the Hex Hunter was initially introduced into the game. Speaking of dungeoneering, many people compare aspects of the Chambers of Xeric raid as well as the Gauntlet to it. Figured I'd throw that in here as there are some similarities between the three. The iconic Karasi sword released in June 2010 became notorious in PvP scenarios for its powerful special attack that rolled 50 to 150% of a user's damage, which would then be inflicted as magic damage to the target. After requests to bring the sword to old school RuneScape, it finally happened in the 2023 Wilderness Boss rework. The main difference being on old school it's bought for a hefty price or obtained in 3 pieces, with each wilderness boss holding a piece of the sword, whereas in RuneScape 3 the Karasi is obtained from a Grandmaster quest and became less popular after the combat update. The Forenthry dungeon was released to house revenants once they were booted from the wilderness after wilderness and free trade saw a return in February of 2011. In November of 2017, Revenants were brought into old school RuneScape and housed inside the Revenant Caves. The cave in its original form had strong similarities to the Forenthry dungeon. Holiday rares, released on the initial RuneScape game in the early 2000s via various holiday events as a one-time thing, are immensely pricey items due to their scarcity. They came to old school as well, with the first batches being released in 2013 from random world spawns. The way this worked initially was when one rare spawn was picked up, another spawned randomly within the world. As the years have gone on, the rares, as they're called on old school, have become more and more common, with loads of them being given out every holiday event. The Dominion Tower, as the name suggests, is a tower in RuneScape 3, released all the way back in November 2011. In this tower, the player can fight quest bosses as they ascend through the tower. The Nightmare Zone, released on old school RuneScape in 2013, draws some similarities from the Dominion Tower, such as allowing the player to fight quest bosses they have previously defeated. During the initial naming of the minigame, it was even called Dom Onion's Cave, a sort of reference or callback to the Dominion Tower due to the similarities between the two. There are some releases in old school RuneScape that are carbon copies of their pre-EOC counterparts. The Grand Exchange, released on the main game in 2007, was released to old school in February 2015. Clan Wars, released in RS3 in December of 2007 as a sort of pity release to help soften the blow of losing old Wilderness PKing. Clan Wars saw a re-release in the old school version of the game on June 19, 2014. The initial Clan Wars release in RuneScape 3 had this weird hub area in the wilderness when it was released, versus Clan Wars having its own area near Al-Kharid on old school. The Corporeal Beast, released in September 2008, was re-released in old school in 2014, albeit without the Divine Sigil drop. It also just kind of magically appeared in old school RuneScape, whereas on RuneScape 3 there was a storyline and a quest to unlock the boss fight. Alright, so I believe this is the first time so far in the video that RuneScape 3 borrowed from old school RuneScape. Skilling pets were released on old school RuneScape before they made their appearance in RuneScape 3. I am specifically talking about pets unlocked from training certain skills, not pets or followers in general. The same goes for traditional boss pets too, that are actually obtained as a drop from the bosses themselves. The first batch saw their release in 2014, while in RuneScape 3 I believe it was in 2015. This isn't including weird pets like the Jad pet on RuneScape 3, as it is obtained from Soul Wars. Continuing the trend of OSRS content that made its way into RuneScape 3, Zuck, the final boss of the Inferno, was released into RuneScape 3 as part of the Elder God Wars update. He also has this cool little bionicle sword. Death's office area in old school RuneScape as of 2020 has been in RuneScape 3 since 2015. Overloads, which in old school are only usable in Nightmare Zone, are originally from RuneScape 3 as a very high level herblore potion. Oh yeah, Nightmare Zone in old school, you can get the Slayer Helm imbue right, lets you slay while getting a ranged and magic damage boost. Well, this boost was first available in RuneScape 3, but to get the boost you had to upgrade the Slayer Helmet with a focus sight and a hex crest. Both of these drops were from strike worms, the desert and jungle ones to be exact. The Amulet of the Damned, first released in old school, gives bonuses while wearing a full Barrow set. So does the Amulet of Forsaken in RuneScape 3, released after. Anachronia, also known as Fossil Island in RuneScape 3, got heavy inspiration from old school RuneScape's Fossil Island. The Tormented Demons released with the Grandmaster quest While Guthic Sleeps heavily influenced the demonic gorilla boss mechanics. For example, Tormented Demons change their prayer every 30 damage or so and switch their attack styles every 3 attacks. They also have an extra attack where they roar and magic fire falls near players. Demonic gorillas do all of these things, only their special attack is a rock falling instead of the magical fire. On the topic of Tormented Demons, their main drop was Dragon Claws back when those were still prominent on RS3. These were released on Old School in 2017, right over 8 years after they emerged in the main game, albeit from a way different source, the Chambers of Xeric, Old School's first raid. Tormented Demons later had their drop table buffed via an additional unique drop in November 2012, the Dragon Limbs, which are used to create the Dragon Crossbow. Old School RuneScape got this edition in 2018, but from Rune and Adamant Dragons. While we're talking about both Tormented Demons and these metal dragons, the Dragon Plate Body arrived into the game in multiple pieces obtained from Tormented Demons in 2008. In Old School, the Plate Body was added with Rune Dragons in 2018. The mostly minor and for some capes utterly useless skill cape perks were in Old School RuneScape before they were in RuneScape 3, despite the capes being in the game for over a decade on RuneScape 3 before the perk update in 2017. The perks differ between the games by a bit. Skilling bosses in Old School RuneScape were fairly successful releases, with Wintertot, Temperos, and Zolcano being well regarded. RuneScape 3 got its first skilling boss in the form of Croesus in late 2021, and I apologize for probably butchering that pronunciation. With the release of Iron Man mode to both games being on the same date, October 13th, 2014, RS3 received the regular Iron Man mode as well as the hardcore Iron Man mode. Old School received the regular Iron Man mode as well, but also received the Ultimate Iron Man version, with the latter disallowing the usage of banks. Hardcore Iron Man wouldn't come to Old School until 2016, and RuneScape 3 hasn't received the Ultimate Iron Man version at the time of this video. Elite Clues were in RuneScape 3 all the way back in 2010. They were released into Old School in June of 2014. Funnily enough, Old School RuneScape was actually the first to get Master Clues back in 2016, whereas RS3 got their Master Clue update in 2018. While they're not out just yet, the proposed Desert Treasure 2 prayers have similarities to the ancient curses that were released on the main game all the way back in December of 2009. Old School RuneScape's now defunct Slayer partner system was brought into the game May 7th, 2015. It was discontinued due to players abusing the system. RS3 had this system first, and while I'm not an avid RuneScape 3 player, I believe it's still in the game, except it's called Social Slayer. The much sought after Max Cape is seen by some players as the ultimate in-game goal. It was brought into the original game in 2011 and brought into Old School in 2015, just 2 years after the game launched. The Blood Fury was originally made from a shard obtained from these ugly things called Edemus. Edemus used to only be a dungeoneering creature but were released outside of Daemonheim with a huge dungeoneering requirement of 115 and a Slayer requirement of 90 in 2014. In mid-2020, Old School got this update, except it was from Veerwatch Sentinels. The Mimic boss was in RuneScape 3 a full 3 years before it showed up in Old School. In RS3, it's not related to clue scrolls though, and is fought via Mimic kill tokens found while training. Old school RuneScape's Mimic is related to Elite and Master clue scrolls and has a better drop table overall when compared to its RuneScape 3 counterpart. The arena where the Mimic is fought is very similar in both games. Orania, also known as ZMI, came to RuneScape all the way back in 2009 and was released approximately 7 years later into old school RuneScape in 2016. Darkmire in RS3, Darkmire in Old School. It was in RuneScape 3 first. Prif in RS3, Prif in Old School. It was also in RuneScape 3 first. Soul Wars was initially in RuneScape 3, released all the way back on February 10th, 2009. It was released into Old School in 2021 with slightly different rewards. Other than that, the release was fairly identical to its pre-EOC counterpart other than the graphics, of course. The same goes for Shooting Stars. They were in RuneScape 3 first in September 2008 and were given to Old School in March 2021. If I remember right, the XP rates when Stars were released all the way back in 2008 were quite a bit higher than what we have now in Old School. The Slayer helmet in RuneScape 3 and the Slayer helmet in Old School are obtained in relatively the same way, unlocked with Slayer points from a Slayer Master. In RuneScape 3, the helm has a quest requirement while the Old School version doesn't. The RS3 one came first for those that don't know. The idea of superior Slayer monsters in Old School seems to have come from Elite Slayer creatures in RuneScape 3. Both have chances to spawn when a regular mob has been killed. Old School's version of these are a lot more impactful but require Slayer points to unlock, whereas RuneScape 3's elite mobs are underwhelming and are there by default if I remember right. RS3's elites came out about a year before Old School's superiors. Next came out all the way back in January 2011 on the main game. It was passed down to Old School 11 years later in January 2022. This is pretty much a direct port from RS3 as far as the boss layer and fight goes. The drop tables do have significant differences, particularly the main drops. On RuneScape 3, Next dropped sets of armor for all three combat styles. At the time of its release, these were best in slot sets. In addition, RS3 got a longbow that was pretty good for its time, basically acting as a beefed up crystal bow, the Zerite bow. Old School got a best in slot melee set in the form of Torva, but did not get Pernix or Virtus, the ranged and magic sets. Instead of a longbow, we got a Zerite crossbow, and we also got an ancient hilt used in creating the ancient godsword. Ring imbues were first found in RuneScape 3 in 2009, introduced with the now deleted minigame Mobilizing Armies. I distinctly remember people thinking the Onyx ring imbue was the best because it gave so much accuracy with moderate strength bonus rather than the imbued Berserker ring for a time. That idea is funny in hindsight. Imbues were first brought into Old School via Nightmare Zone in 2013, although nowadays there are a few options to imbue rings. Bounty Hunter was brought to Old School in various iterations over the years, beginning in September of 2014. In Old School, it involves being assigned a target in normal wilderness to my knowledge. The original Bounty Hunter was brought into the game after the controversial Wilderness and Free Trade removal update. It restricted players to a large crater where they would be assigned targets. PvP worlds were first found in RuneScape 3 before they saw their Old School release. The Crystal Halberd made its way into RuneScape 3 before it was released as a diary reward on Old School RuneScape. Lastly, the proposed rings that are going to be released with Desert Treasure 2 are more than likely going to utilize the original 4 Dagannoth King rings based on poll results. RuneScape 3 did the same thing somewhat recently to make new best in slot rings for certain styles. It requires 10 rings of one type to make that specific upgrade. So for example, the Warrior Ring upgrade, 10 Warrior Rings and the new drop is needed in order to make the new ring. I doubt Old School is going to require 10 rings, but I do see them using the same concept for the new rings. I'm sure I missed quite a bit due to how large both games are and how long they've been around, but that's about all I have for you guys in this video. This is the RuneScape Historian, checking out. Peace guys, and take care.